Hi, I'm Rohas Nagpal, and in this video, I'm going to discuss the basics of the blockchain technology. Let's start with the basic concept. A blockchain ecosystem is built across addresses, a ledger, and data. Addresses can be considered to be like your bank account number. So, similarly to that, you would have an address on a blockchain, and people would be able to send you assets using that address. A ledger is going to represent all the transactions that are being done by all the addresses on the blockchain. And the fundamental concept of a blockchain is that the ledger is shared, which means anybody having a node on the blockchain would be able to see all the transactions happening between all the addresses. And finally, you have data, which could be metadata relating to the transactions or proper identification and other records which can also be stored onto the blockchain. Although I'd like to clarify right in the beginning, storing a lot of data is not a good use case for any blockchain solution. Blockchains are really built for smart asset lifecycle management, and I'm going to talk about that very soon. Now let's have a look at how a blockchain would conceptually look. So here we see this red layer where we say the addresses, the shared ledger, and the data is stored. And here what we see are nodes. Now a node could be a laptop, a server, even a cell phone in some cases. And fundamentally what a node is supposed to do is it is supposed to have all the data. So it would know all the addresses, all the transactions in the ledger, and all the data. However, practically there are times that we may architect the blockchain in a different way, and there may be different types of nodes. So for example, you could have validator or mining nodes. So if it's a proof of work blockchain, and we're going to come to that concept very soon, the nodes could be involved in mining, that is validating the transactions by doing some mathematical calculations, but it is not necessary that each node is going to mine. Some nodes may simply hold the data, while other nodes may hold the data as well as mine or validate transactions. In a scenario where we do not have a pure public blockchain, but we have a private called a federated or a hybrid blockchain, we could have administrative nodes, which basically means these nodes would control the permissions that other nodes have. So blockchains can be of many different types. And later in this program, we are going to design our own hybrid blockchain. At that time, a lot of these concepts would become much clearer to you. Now, once we've understood the basic meaning of a node, let's see how a typical blockchain ecosystem could be developed. So here, let's say we have two banks, so bank A and bank B, and then we have, say, a company C. Each of these entities is communicating with the blockchain. So here what you see is a private or internal network of the bank or the company, which is connected to a node on the blockchain. So this is a node operated by bank A, and the internal network communicates with this node using the blockchain API service. Again, later in this program, we are going to see API in a lot more detail. Additionally, this entity could maintain other nodes also for redundancy. So in the normal world, we constantly need to back up data. In the blockchain world, backing up is really simple. All you need to do is connect another node to the blockchain, and automatically all the data is going to get synced there. So bank A decides it would have one node to which it connects its internal network through API, and another node to which it is simply not connecting itself but maintaining it, let's say for a redundancy purpose. Same could be bank B, same could be company C. On this side here, if it's a hybrid scenario or a federated blockchain, we could have admin nodes. These are the nodes which will decide which entity or which node can connect to the blockchain and what permissions does it have. Can that other node mine? Can it send and receive assets? Can it issue new assets? Can it publish data onto the blockchain? All that can be controlled. We could also have a node which is connected to a web interface and simply functions as a blockchain explorer, where in a simple user interface, you are able to see all the transactions that are happening on the blockchain in real time. Now let's see what a node would conceptually look like. So a node, like I said, could be a server, a laptop, even a cell phone. And fundamentally, the first thing that it is going to have is an operating system. Many people feel that a blockchain in itself is everything. That's not true. You first need an operating system on which you are going to install the blockchain framework. Now, this operating system, depending upon the blockchain, could be Linux, Windows, Mac. So, different blockchain frameworks support different operating systems. Now, this should be hardened, which basically means security would be done. A lot of people again think that blockchains cannot be hacked. Actually, that's wrong on multiple levels. So, at the most basic level, if someone is able to break through the operating system because there were vulnerabilities or holes left in it, that's one way they could hack the blockchain. Or then they could find and exploit a flaw in the framework itself. Or then there would be scenarios when someone manages to steal private keys. This is something we are going to cover in detail in the security aspect of our program. So let's say that now we've set up our operating system and we've hardened it. We've put a firewall in place. We've closed a lot of the ports that are not required. All that is done. The next conceptual layer would be where the keys and the assets are. Now, keys, usually the most common method used today in blockchains is the ECDSA, or the elliptical curve digital signature algorithm. And using this algorithm, keys and addresses are generated. We're going to come to that very soon. And this is what is going to be used for creating assets, transferring assets, even burning assets. Then we have the coins or the tokens, which are assets on the blockchain. Now, we use the term coin when a blockchain has its own single native asset. So, for example, when we look at the Bitcoin blockchain, Bitcoin is the only asset that it supports. So, we say Bitcoin is a coin. But when we look at a blockchain like Ethereum, for example, one is ETH, which is the native crypto for the blockchain. So, we say ETH is the coin on the Ethereum blockchain. But people can now go and create their own digital assets on Ethereum, and those are called tokens because they are not native to the blockchain, but they are created on the blockchain after the blockchain has been set up. So ETH then is a coin, and something like the basic attention token or the BAT, that would be a token. Then we have the framework. So there are lots and lots of open source frameworks available, some of which you may have heard about. For example, Ethereum in itself or multi-chain. Bitcoin has an open source framework which you can use to set up your own blockchain. So you would take a call on which blockchain framework to use depending upon your use case. So there are times where you may feel that for our use case, let's just use an existing public blockchain and maybe connect our node to it, or maybe simply use the API service offered by that public blockchain. Or you may feel that for your use case, you need to set up your own private or hybrid blockchain. In that case, you would choose the right framework and set up your own blockchain. And that's something we are going to see in detail later in this program. Then we have the API layer, which I'm going to again explain in some time. It basically makes it very easy for a developer to connect his or her application to a blockchain without really knowing blockchain programming. So suppose in your application, let's say you're building an application in Python, and now you simply want from your application a request to go to the blockchain to generate a new address, and you want the address to be returned. You don't need to know anything about blockchain programming. You just need to call the API, send the request, and whatever output comes, display it to the user, store it in a database, or do whatever you want with it. So APIs make our lives really, really easy. And then finally, we have the layer where we have the web and mobile applications, which would be the user interface that the different entities could use. So conceptually, this is what a blockchain node would be. Now let's get into some of the technical issues. The first concept that we need to understand is a hash function. Now a hash function, which is also called a one-way hash function, takes any input and gives us an output with a fixed number of units. So let's take a simple example of what we mean. There is a very popular one-way hash function called SHA-256, and whatever input you give it, it is always going to return to you a hexadecimal number with 64 digits. So now, suppose I take the word Sanya in all small letters, it is going to return this 64 character hexadecimal number to me. If the word Sanya is written in all capital letters, it is going to return 64 characters, but as you can see, they are very different. Similarly, let's say only S was capital, then again it gives me a different output. Now all these three outputs are 64 characters, they are hexadecimal, but they are differing because when the input changes, the output changes. Let's say I took a 10,000 page PDF document or a one page Word document. Again, I'm getting 64 character outputs, but the output changes. Now, this is a mathematical function, which means no matter who puts this SHA-256 library in their code, no matter whether that is Python or PHP or Windows or Linux or Mac, as long as you're using the same mathematical function, which is SHA-256 in this case, the output is going to be identical. Now, it's very important to remember that no matter which programming language you're using or which operating system you're using, the output of SHA-256 for any given input is going to be the same across platforms. So as long as the input is this Sanya in all small letters, you are always going to get this output irrespective of whether this is happening in a PHP program, a Python program, a Windows operating system, Mac, it doesn't make a difference. Because a hash function is a mathematical formula not dependent upon the technology which is used to implement that formula. Now, if you're a little new to hexadecimal, let me just explain to you what that means. As human beings, we commonly use the decimal system, which is 0 to 9. In hexadecimal, there are 16 digits, which is 0 to 9 represented as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10 is represented as A, B is equal to 11, C is 12, D is 13, E is 14 and F is 15. So that is why when you look at something like this, it is not just an alphanumeric string, it is actually a number. And in the decimal form, this thing that you see here is actually this number. The second one is this number, third and fourth. So as you can notice here, in this first one, we have only the first digit 0. Then in the second one, we have two digits which are 0 and 3 and 4. And every time that we are replacing a number with a 0, we can see that in decimal, that number is reducing in value. And that's important because very soon we are going to see that in a blockchain, we talk about difficulty level and the fact that a hash should be below a certain number. And that is exactly what happens when we add these zeros. So that is why I'm going to later talk about a hash starting with a certain number of zeros. And this is the logic behind it. Now, along with this video, there is this presentation and in that links are there. So you could use this link to convert between hexadecimal and decimal just to revise and understand the concept better. Now let's just summarize what we've understood about hash functions. So a hash function takes an electronic record, which could be a PDF, a Word file, a video, email, transaction, text strings, anything, and produces a fixed length output. For example, 64 characters in the case of SHA-256. Now, if that information is changed in any way, even a comma is changed in a 3000 page document, a completely different output value is produced. And that is why hash functions are used for ensuring and checking data integrity, that the data has not been modified. And they are called one-way hash functions because you can go from that input document to the hash function result of say 64 characters but not backwards, which means if I give you the 64 characters only, there is no way for you to measure what the original input was, because even a single character could give you a 64 character output. A 10,000 page document could also give you 64 characters. So there's no real way for you to go from those 64 characters back to what the original was. Now let's understand the next concept, which is a Merkle tree. So let's say we have 4 transactions. Now what could this transaction look like? So let's say this, what you see in the yellow colored box, is a transaction. So it has an address of the person sending an asset, address of the person receiving the asset, the name of the asset, which in this example is Sanya coin, and the quantity. So let's say 25 Sanya coins are being sent from this address which starts with 15 to this address which starts with 12. Now this transaction is going to be signed by the sender's private key. We'll understand this concept of private and public key a little later. But let's just say that the sender has a key pair, a private key to sign addresses, and a public key to verify that actually that person has signed the message. Now let's say this, along with its digital signature, is transaction 1. Similarly, we have transaction 2, transaction 3, transaction 4. Now for transaction 1, we calculate a hash, which is here. For transaction 2, we have a hash here. So similarly, like we have transaction 1, 2, 3 and 4, we can say we have hash 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now we have 4 hashes, let's half them. So we take hash 1 and hash 2 and join it to each other, concatenate. Again run it through the hash function and now we have 1 hash. Similarly, we take 3 and 4, join them or concatenate them, run it through the hash and we get a hash here. Now we are left with 2 hashes. Let's join them till we are left with 1. So irrespective of how many transactions we started with, whether it's 4 or 40 or 40,000, ultimately we want one single hash. And this final hash that we have is called the Merkle root. And this entire structure is called the Merkle tree. Now let's move to the next concept, which is proof of work. Now this concept was actually not invented for blockchains. It was invented for a very different problem. And that problem was of spam email and distributed denial of service attacks. Now let's see what the issue with spam email is. It's very easy for a spammer to click a button and send out millions if not billions of emails. Secondly, a hacker launching a denial of service attack could control multiple machines or even from a single machine send out a lot of requests to a web server, overwhelm it and crash it. So somebody came out with this idea that can we make sure that before a spammer or anybody sends out an email, they are required to do some work. So proof of work is an algorithm or a mechanism by which the sender of the email could prove that his system has done some work before the email has gone and the receiver can verify that work very easily. So the sender does a lot of work, the receiver does very little work, and if the work is correctly done and that can be found out by the receiver easily, the email will be accepted, otherwise the email will be deleted. Let's see what that actually looks like. So let's say we've developed a proof of work mechanism where we are going to take the sender's email address, then put this small delimiter, is just a random symbol, then the receiver's email address, then the timestamp, and finally a nonce or a number. So let's take an example. In this case, Sanya@example.com is the sender of an email. Samaira@example.com is the receiver of the email. This is the timestamp. So as you know, this is the Unix timestamp format. So although it looks like simply a number, it's actually representing a date and time. Now when this information is concatenated, at the end of it, we have to now find a number which we call a nonce, such that when this entire string is passed through the SHA-256 hash, the resulting hash begins with 4 zeros. So hash begins with 4 zeros. Now it's an arbitrary thing. You could do with 5 zeros, 6 zeros. I've just taken an example of 4 zeros. So now when we take the nonce as 0 and we take this entire string and we run it through the hash function, we can see the resultant is not beginning with 4 zeros. It's beginning with 6D64. So we realize 0 is not the correct nonce. We move it to 1. Again we run it through the hash function and we realize no, it's starting with 6479. So again this is not the correct nonce. We will increase this nonce one by one till we finally get a nonce where the resulting hash begins with 4 zeros. And in this example we can see it's 161000. When this entire string is hashed, the resultant hash begins with 4 zeros. So now we can say for this particular string or email, this nonce is correct. Now it's very important for us to realize two things. For any given string, an infinite number of nonces will exist. But it's important for us to just find the first one that works. Secondly, computing this nonce is not trivial, which basically means calculating which nonce is correct is not trivial, it takes effort. But verification is very simple. You just need to check one. And if that one nonce matches, you accept the email, otherwise you reject it. Now, like I said, there can be an infinite number of nonces for any given string. Let's take an example. So we take the two email addresses from the previous example, we put the timestamp, and now we have to calculate the nonce. And if you write a program to do this, you will instantly realize that there are so many different nonces that are actually giving us a hash output beginning with 4 zeros. So what's important to remember is that in a proof of work system, all you need to do is calculate the first nonce that satisfies the algorithm. There are so many different nonces, just get the first one and the work is done. And that's what actually happens in reality in proof of work systems. Now let's take an example of a proof of work which is implemented within an email service. Of course, this is not really available today because even though proof of work was invented for email spam control, the email service providers didn't really take on this concept and they use other methods like you would see SPF, Sender Policy Framework, or DKIM, Domain Key Internet Management. They use multiple ways of figuring out whether an email is spam or malicious or not. But let's say, hypothetically, if we were to do this in an email, how would it look? So we know that in emails there is a header where you can see a lot of information like the message ID. Then of course we have the time of that email. We have the sender and receiver's email addresses. So let's say we were to take all this and develop a proof of work mechanism where we first take the message ID, then we concatenate the sender's email address, the receiver's email address, the timestamp, and now we have to calculate the nonce such that when this entire string is hashed, the resulting hash begins with 4 zeros. So in this example, what would happen is when the sender clicks send, the sender's email server is going to calculate the nonce, which in this example could be 89804, and then pass that nonce in the email header under, say, a category called POW, where it would say that this string would pass with a nonce of 89804. Now the receiver would simply check, actually the server would automatically check that does this 89804 when added to this string result in a hash starting with 4 zeros. If yes, let's trust this email and download it, otherwise let's delete it. Now let's try to understand what the innovation of Bitcoin actually was, because that's how the world's first blockchain was created. Now in the physical world, can you double spend a currency note? No. Once I give this 100 euro note to you, it's no longer with me and I cannot spend it again. It's now yours to spend. But in the world of virtual currencies, electronic records could be very easily duplicated. So let's say I make a Word document in which I write that I owe you 100 euro. Now I send it to you. It's one file, but you could very easily do a copy paste and make 100 Word documents out of it. And now instead of paying you 100 euro, I owe you 10,000 euro. That obviously doesn't make sense. So the real innovation of Bitcoin was, for the first time, a technology was created or a system was created where you could issue digital coins which are not monitored by a central agency but still cannot be duplicated or double spent. And that is where Bitcoin, using a combination of hash functions, the Merkle root we spoke about, proof of work, digital signatures, put all this together in an innovative fashion to create the world's first virtual currency. Now let's understand how blockchain works. So now every blockchain begins with the first block or the genesis block, which is also called as the block 0. Now in the first block, none of the rules of the blockchain apply because the rules are going to be codified in that block. So for ease of understanding, let's presume that our blockchain is already running and we've reached, let's say, block number 18. And now we are going to examine the header of block number 17 in detail. Now I am oversimplifying it, but it will help you to understand the concept of how Bitcoin actually works. So let's say every 10 minutes, all the transactions that are happening on the Bitcoin network are taken and moved to a memory pool, and then a bunch of miners is going to try to put those transactions into a block by solving a mathematical problem, which is actually simply calculating a nonce. So now what is this string going to look like for which they have to calculate a nonce? So So let's have a look at this. So suppose we examine block number 17, and let's say during those few minutes, the transactions which were done, which are now going to go into block 17, let's say only 4 transactions took place. Transaction 1, 2, 3, 4. As we've discussed before, we can calculate the Merkle root. So for transaction 1, we have hash 1, for 2, hash 2, 3, 4. Then we concatenated these two and we got these two hashes, and finally we were left with one, which we call the Merkle root. Now this Merkle root or transaction root is put here. So that's one of the components of the header of this block. Then the previous block, which is block 16, which is already done, the hash of that is put here. The timestamp of block 17 is put here, and now the miners are supposed to calculate a nonce such that when these 4 things are concatenated and run through a hash function, the resultant hash begins with a certain number of zeros as specified by the algorithm. Now this number of zeros can be changed, and you would wonder, why would it need to be changed? And the reason is the system is going to keep adjusting its difficulty. I'll explain to you how that works. So in Bitcoin, it should be done that a block is mined on an average of 10 minutes. That means every 10 minutes, some miner should calculate the correct nonce. But is it possible to predict how long it's going to take to create these nonces? No. It's possible in a particular block, the nonce was calculated in a minute, in another one it could take 30 minutes. So what the system does is approximately every 2 weeks, it checks the blockchain to see what was the average time taken to mine a block. If that average time was more than 10 minutes, the system thinks it's difficult, so it's taking miners more time, so it reduces the difficulty level. Then again the system runs for 2 weeks, and then the system again checks, and now it says, oh, it's only taken an average of 8 minutes. What does that mean? It's become easy. So then the difficulty level is increased. So the blockchain is constantly readjusting the difficulty level to ensure an average of 10 minutes per block. Now, as we can see from what we have understood, a blockchain is an ordered and time-stamped record. So every block knows which is the block before it. So there's an order to it. There's a timestamp on each block. This system prevents double spending. That means once you have a particular Bitcoin which has been spent, you cannot spend it again. And it prevents modification of previous records because every block knows the details of the block that came before it. So it makes it difficult for anyone to modify any of the previous records. Now let's understand certain Bitcoin blockchain related facts. Now Bitcoin's first block, which is block 0, was mined on January 3rd, 2009 at 11:45 p.m. GMT. Now in Bitcoin, as we all know, we say that the number of Bitcoins is fixed at 21 million. No more than 21 million Bitcoins will ever be generated. Now how does this actually happen? So what happens is, every time that a block is mined, a block reward is generated. So when block 0 was created, there was no Bitcoin. After that, for every block, 50 new Bitcoins were being created and given as a reward to the miner who mined that block. So if multiple miners are working on a block, the first one to calculate the nonce would effectively be paid 50 Bitcoin as a reward. Plus, of course, they could get the transaction fee of all the transactions in that block. But for the time being, let's ignore that part. Now, in the beginning, it was 50 Bitcoin per block as a reward. But every approximately 4 years, this reward would halve. So it started with 50, became 25, then 12 and a half, and today it is 6.25. So like this, every 4 years, this reward will keep becoming half till the year 2140 AD, which is more than 100 years to go, by when all 21 bitcoins would be created, 21 million bitcoins would be created, and the block reward would now become zero, and miners would only get transaction fee and no block reward anymore. Now, one thing we must remember in the world of blockchain, time is not measured in the conventional sense. Everything is measured in terms of blocks. So when I say that the system halves the number of bitcoins being rewarded every 4 years, it's actually every 210,000 blocks. That takes an approximate of 4 years depending upon that average of 10 minutes per block. Then we also spoke that every 2 minutes the system looks back and sees how was the difficulty level, what was the average time being taken by the miners, and accordingly adjusting the difficulty level. So it's not actually 2 weeks, it's every 2016 blocks, which is an average of 2 weeks. All the blockchain events, like you may notice even an ICO which is coming out with a new coin, they would measure or tell you when that event is going to happen based on a block number. So if you're doing something on the Ethereum blockchain, you would say that this particular action, whatever we are doing, is going to take place at block number so and so. So in the blockchain world, blocks is how we measure time. And another thing I'd like you to understand is that in Bitcoin, why do transactions take time? So in the conventional world, you make a UPI payment or a Master or a Visa card payment and it goes through in milliseconds or seconds at most. But in the blockchain world, or especially in the world of Bitcoin, transactions take a much longer time. And soon we are going to understand why that happens. Now to understand why Bitcoin transactions can end up taking a lot of time, sometimes up to an hour, let's just go back to how the blockchain functions. So like we saw here, a miner is going to be calculating a nonce. Now let's say at a given point of time for a particular block, multiple miners find a nonce that fits. All of them broadcast this over the network and certain other miners will start following you once they come to know that you found the correct nonce. But now let's say 4 people found the correct nonce and the rest of the miners are now divided into groups, each following a different miner. Now suddenly what's actually happened is the blockchain has split into multiple chains, and this actually happens all the time. And then from time to time the system checks, are there multiple blockchains running? If so, only let the longest chain run and delete the shorter chains. So sometimes what can happen is a transaction which appears to go through will suddenly in some time show as failed, because maybe it was approved in a particular block which subsequently got deleted because that chain was removed. So you realize your transactions no longer gone through. And this does create a lot of real world problems. So for example, there used to be this particular cafe I used to go to, and when you enter, he would ask you a question: are you going to pay by Bitcoin or by card? Now if you say card, he'd let you come in, have your coffee and pay on the way out. But if you said Bitcoin, he would ask you to first make the payment, then enter, then he would serve you coffee. Because he knew that you needed to give at least 6 confirmations before you could trust that the Bitcoin transaction has gone through. And at an average of 10 minutes a block, 6 confirmation means 6 blocks have been mined after the block in which your transaction went through. And that is the reason you would wait for 6 into 10, that's 60 minutes. There's something interesting I wanted to share. So if we look at the raw hexadecimal version of the Bitcoin Genesis block, that's where you find a newspaper headline embedded, which is from the Times of 3rd Jan 2009, which says the Chancellor is on the brink of a second bailout for banks. So if you recall, this was around, in the 2008 financial meltdown that happens. Well, this relates to that, and in 2009 a lot of the banks were being bailed out. So this particular headline has been embedded into the Genesis block, and that's the reason a lot of people say that the whole purpose of Bitcoin is to destroy the conventional banking system and give the world its first decentralized virtual currency. Now let's just try to examine what a block would look like in a blockchain explorer. So all public blockchains have explorers, which are web interfaces which anybody can go without even needing to log in, get access to all the transactions that are taking place. So if we look at the Bitcoin blockchain explorer, I've just randomly picked up for block 703326. So it tells us that this block was mined on October 3rd, 2021 at this time GMT by this entity, which may be a miner or a pool of miners. Now it says it currently has 5 confirmations on the Bitcoin blockchain. What does that mean? After this particular block 703326 has been mined, 5 more blocks have been mined. So we usually wait till 6 confirmations, which means if I am to trust the transactions in this block, I would wait for 1 more confirmation, and then I can say with a reasonable degree of confidence that the transactions are through. Then it says that the miners of this block earned a total reward which is composed of 2 things: a base reward of 6.25 Bitcoin, which is about $300,000, and an additional 0.057 Bitcoin, which is the transaction fee paid by the total of 1113, that is 1113 transactions which were included in this block. Now this block reward is also called the Coinbase reward, and when Bitcoin started it was 50 in a block. After the first halving it became 25, then 12.5, and currently it is 6.25, and after the next halving it will become 3.125, and it will keep reducing like that. Now let's just quickly summarize what a miner does. So just like a gold miner digs into the earth to discover gold, a Bitcoin miner uses computational power to calculate hashes, or rather to calculate nonces. To add an entire block to the blockchain, the miner has to successfully hash a block header to a value below the target threshold. So as we explained in the beginning, hashes could begin with a certain number of zeros. Hashes are represented in a hexadecimal format, and depending upon the difficulty level, the certain number of zeros would be determined, and the first miner to do it would successfully broadcast this to the blockchain, and miners would then start following the block that has just been created, and subsequently the new blocks can be set up. So what is the cost that a miner incurs? The cost is of electricity and computational power, and the reward they get is the block reward as well as transaction fee. And many miners operate as pools rather than individuals. Now, hash rate is a very important concept, and it signifies the speed of mining measured in terms of hashes per second. That is the number of times that hash values are calculated for proof of work every second, and they are measured in kilo, which is 1000, mega, which is million, giga, which is billion, and tera, which is trillion. Now this is an example of a mining machine which works for Bitcoin as well as Bitcoin Cash. And if you look here, you will understand the speed. So it is 10.5 tera hashes per second, which means it is going to generate 10.5 trillion hashes per second. And mining pools or miners have multiple machines like this. So you can understand the massive amount of computational power which is there in the Bitcoin network. And obviously this consumes a lot of electricity, and that is why many people say that Bitcoin is bad for the environment because of the amount of electricity it consumes. But I think that's an unfair thing to say, because look at the conventional world. Are we trying to say banks do not consume energy? Look at any bank, it has massive buildings, hundreds of thousands of employees. They are going to be having employees flying around the world, private jets, cars, buses. Do they not generate pollution? Of course they do. So it's a little unfair to single out Bitcoin for the pollution that we see in the world. Every economic activity in the world is going to cause pollution, is going to consume energy. So we've got to measure the benefits and the costs of any technology. Now let's briefly talk about transaction fees. So whenever a new Bitcoin block is generated, the information of all the transactions during that particular period are included in the block, and the transaction fees are collected by the miner. Now remember, transaction fees are voluntary. That means you can always choose to broadcast your transaction while not paying fee with it. But then again, remember, it is not mandatory that the miner has to accept your transaction. So that is the reason it is always recommended that you do say that you are ready to pay an X amount of transaction fee. Now let's take a quick look at the Ethereum blockchain explorer called Etherscan. So as we can see, a lot of the information would seem very similar to the way we do it on a Bitcoin explorer. But one interesting thing I'd like to show. So some time ago, Ethereum based project called as Poly Network was hacked. And the hacker then took a huge amount of crypto and then decided to not actually use that crypto but decided to actually give it back. So that hacker started to communicate with the administrators of the project through the Ethereum blockchain, which means he was pushing transactions to the Ethereum blockchain with zero ETH actually being consumed, but metadata being put into it. So a message like this: what if I make a new token and let the DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, decide where the tokens go? So this was the data that he pushed onto the blockchain, paid transaction fee for it, but zero Ethereum were involved in this transaction. As you can see here, the value of this transaction was 0 Ether. The real value was this metadata. So you can actually communicate with people through the blockchain. And in fact, many of you may not know this, but you can even use the Ethereum blockchain for sending emails. Details for that are in the link which is at the end of this module. The reading material includes an article on sending emails on the Ethereum network. Now, proof of work, as we have understood, causes that the moment a block is mined, the miner would immediately sell some of the reward that they've got because they have got costs to pay. Cost for the computational power, for the electricity. So the moment the miner successfully mines, some amount of the newly earned coins he's going to spend. So this creates a selling pressure. A very nice innovation is the concept of coins where you don't mine but you stake. These coins motivate the holders that instead of selling your coin, you hold it for a longer period. And by holding the coin, you can stake them, which means lock them, and then validate transactions and actually get paid for that. So now instead of a selling pressure, it incentivizes you to hold crypto. So for example, if you are using the EOS blockchain, their native is EOS, and you hold or stake your EOS cryptos, you could earn 1 to 2% per annum, which is again paid to you in EOS itself. So like this, you could do it for NEO, ONE, XTZ, Tron, QTM. Lots of blockchains support staking. And now Ethereum is also moving towards proof of stake. And then you will be able to stake your ETH and actually earn money. Now in the beginning of this video, we spoke about keys and addresses. So let's take a slightly deep dive into what do they actually do and what do they look like. So when we look at a Bitcoin paper wallet, what does that mean? That you could actually print this information out on a piece of paper or write it down and it would serve as your wallet. So in cryptos, wallets are a very essential concept. A wallet basically holds your keys. And if somebody else gets hold of your keys, they could control your crypto, which is why we usually say, not your keys, not your coins. Which means if you do not have the private key to your address, you don't actually control your crypto. So in many exchanges, when you hold your crypto on the exchange, the private keys for your address are actually held by the exchange. And tomorrow they could vanish with it and you wouldn't be able to do anything. So now when you create a Bitcoin wallet, this is what happens. You create 4 things effectively. A private key, which is what you would use to sign transactions and transfer the Bitcoin. A public key, which is used to verify transactions. An address, which is a smaller version of the public key. And WIF, or a wallet import format, which is the shorter version of your private key. So when anybody has to send you Bitcoin, all they need to know is your address. And when you want to move your Bitcoin, you need to have your private key. Now let's take an example. Here we have just created a brand new Bitcoin wallet. So we have an address. Now this address, as we can say, begins with 1LE. So let's copy it and take it to the Bitcoin Explorer and enter it. Now when we do that, it says that there are two blockchains which have this particular address. Now you'll wonder, how is that even possible? We just created it for Bitcoin. Let me explain the background. So at one time, a lot of the Bitcoin miners felt that Bitcoin should be improved, the technology should be upgraded so that the speed increases. So they wanted to bring in the SegWit technology, increase the block size. But a lot of miners said, no, let's leave Bitcoin the way it is. Now, because all the miners did not agree, the Bitcoin blockchain forked into two. So at the time of the forking, the BTC, which was the Bitcoin original, whatever amount of that you held, you immediately got the same amount in terms of BCH, which is Bitcoin Cash, the newly created crypto. So it's one single blockchain splitting into two, and at the time of the split, you would get the same number of coins on the new blockchain as you had on the original blockchain, and then onwards, both the blockchains continue separately. So today we have BTC, which is Bitcoin, and BCH, which is Bitcoin Cash. Now there are other derivatives also. That is why whenever we talk about a crypto, we always also mention the symbol. So you wouldn't just say BTC or Bitcoin, you would say both. So Bitcoin in brackets BTC, Bitcoin Cash in bracket BCH, so that you don't go wrong with the crypto that you're actually talking about. Then when we go to the Explorer, we can also see that it shows us the estimated hash rate of the entire network, and we can see the memory pool, how the size of that is changing. So as I had explained earlier to you, this is where unconfirmed transactions are stored. So the amount of the unconfirmed transactions also varies from block to block, and you can see the movement of that here. Now, when you are looking at any blockchain explorer, you can always see the latest blocks. The height basically represents the block number, when it was mined, how much time ago, who was the miner, the size of the block. You can also see all the latest transactions that are happening. So you will be able to see the hash of the transactions, the time, the amounts. You can then drill down. You can go into a particular block and see information like the hash, the number of confirmations that have happened after this block was mined, the timestamp, which was the miner, the number of transactions that happened in that block. Then you can see the difficulty level, the Merkle root, all this information that we've already discussed. You can even see the nonce. Then you can drill down further and you can look at all the transactions that have taken place in the block, and each and every transaction can be examined by you. You can then drill down into the addresses involved in those transactions. So for example, here I've taken a particular address, and now I can see that that address has transacted 2202 times on the Bitcoin blockchain. It has received a total of 7724 Bitcoin and has sent a total of 7622 Bitcoins, and the current value of the address is 101 Bitcoin. All this information is visible to us. So we can see that here also. So we can drill down further and see each and every transaction that that particular address has made. Now let me briefly introduce the concept of API. We are going to do a lot more practicals on this, but to just explain what it means, let me just show you the interface of the Future Money wallet. So it's one of the projects that I manage. Now in this, I pick a lot of data relating to the crypto industry and display it in a user interface. So for example, when you click on markets, it shows you that as of right now, there are 7,163 active cryptos. There are 429 active exchanges. Now obviously this data is going to constantly change. So where am I as a developer going to get this data from, and that to keep displaying the latest updated version? So there could be prices of different cryptos, there could be velocities. If I scroll down a little bit more, so I could be pulling the real-time values of a lot of the cryptos. And here, for example, if you click on Bitcoin, it generates a Bitcoin paper wallet for you. or you could click Ethereum, Litecoin, etc. Now, as a developer, how do I do all this? That's where the concept of API comes in. So there are API service providers. I would connect to that service, and then from my code. So for example, when a user comes into my application, clicks on the Bitcoin button, I send a request to this API service provider, who then hits the Bitcoin blockchain maybe, or in whatever manner generates those addresses and gives me the response which I can display here. So as a developer, I don't need to know anything about connecting to the Bitcoin blockchain. I simply call an API provided by a service provider, and then that service provider does all the magic for me and gives me the response. This makes it really easy for a developer to build blockchain applications without actually doing blockchain development, so to say. Let's take another example of this. So let's say I go to the developer dashboard, and here I can see there's a button called latest block. I click on it, and immediately it is pulling up in real time the absolute latest block that has been mined on the Bitcoin blockchain. And it shows me a whole bunch of information about that block, including the raw information, which could look like this. So how do I do this? Now I will show you the coding part of it, that how do I actually call this API. Now here I can see a little bit of code, very simple to understand, that I need to pass the URL which is provided to me by the API service provider. So it is called BlockCypher, and in that I'm going to V1 or version 1 BTC for Bitcoin main. And when I hit this URL, it generates a lot of information, which is, as you can see, is here, and then I can decide from this information how much do I want to display on my page. So when I hit the URL, it gives me the name, block height, the timestamp, and I could choose which of this I want to display and which I don't. So I want to display the block height, but I don't want to display the block hash. So I can choose that, and then I can write my code which displays that for my end user. So this is a very simple overview of APIs. Later in this program, we are going to go into API in great detail. Now, before I conclude, I'd like to cover the concept of encryption, because many times, depending upon the use case, you may want to add some data to the blockchain, but you don't want that data accessible to everybody. In that scenario, symmetric encryption can be very useful. Symmetric encryption means the same password or credentials are used to encrypt as well as decrypt the data. So for example, let's take this sentence. So Bruce Lee said, "I fear not the man, blah, blah, blah." This entire sentence we take and we encrypt it. So if we use the AES, which is as of today considered one of the strongest encryption, symmetric encryption algorithms, advanced encryption standard, when we encrypt using it, it generates three things: the password, the initialization vector, and the authentication tag. Now, these three pieces of information are needed to decrypt this back to the original. So now these three pieces can be given to three different entities, and then only when all three entities come together, enter their credentials, then this particular encrypted data can be converted back to the original form, which can be easily read. So blockchains are not actually built for storing data. Blockchains are built for smart asset lifecycle management. I mentioned that right in the beginning. Now I'll explain what does that really mean. It means you can create a smart asset, which is basically an asset on the blockchain. Now, a smart asset could be an equity share, could be money as in dollars, or it could be a debenture, a bond. It could be virtually anything. We can create it. After that, the blockchain can take care of its life cycle, whether it needs to be escrowed, whether it needs to be transferred, whether it needs to be changed from one place to another. All that can be automated and done without the need for third parties because of the blockchain technology. So blockchains also support something called atomic transfers. So when you're making a complex transaction, either the transaction goes through completely or it fails completely, but it will not get stuck halfway. And that is the reason blockchains do not need manual reconciliation to be done. And because of that being the core use case, you will realize almost every blockchain use case that doesn't revolve around smart assets will actually end up failing. But of course, we are going to discuss that in great detail later in this program. Now that you've understood that, okay, symmetric encryption is one way of putting confidential data into the blockchain, the last concept that I want to explain is digital signatures. Now, why are digital signatures important? Because that is the fundamental way in which smart assets are transferred on the blockchain. You would need your private key to generate a digital signature, which would then allow a transaction to go through. Now, using the ECDSA or the elliptical curve digital signature algorithm, this is what a private key looks like, and this is what a public key looks like. Now, if we take this sample data, a statement by Bruce Lee, and then we sign it using this private key, the digital signature looks like this. This is just an example to show you what it actually looks like. Now, to verify this digital signature, anybody in the world could use your public key, as well as they need the sample data and the digital signature. Once they have all this information, they can verify whether it was actually your private key that signed the data. So in conclusion, a private key is what you keep with yourself and you sign transactions with it. A public key is what you distribute to the world, and that is what the world uses to verify that you have actually digitally signed a particular piece of information. Later in this program, we are going to actually create digital signatures directly using the blockchain. But for now, this is what the concept is. I hope you found this video useful. You will also have access to this presentation, and I've made a list of reading material which you should read after you've listened to this video.